Yeah, thank you. Well, what we're going to do, we're doing it in these strange times. There's normally we would do a talk together, and it would be slightly less of an awkward double act when we were each in our own houses and doing half each. But thanks for the introduction. Yeah, Marc and I are co-directors of Moder Dy, which is a community interest company we set up a couple of years ago to record and share Shetland's maritime heritage. I'm an archaeologist. Marc is a specialist in Shetland boats, and so between us we cover most of the angles for Shetland's maritime heritage. So I'm going to start off, and then partway through I will hand over to Marc. I will roughly get you till partway through the Viking period, and then we'll hand over, and Marc will take you on from there. So Marc, do you want to share your screen again?
Yeah, sorry, I thought it was on screen share actually.
I'm not buying that for 1 minute. So he's great at singing and his voice is me.
Okay. There you go.
Brilliant. Thank you. Do you want to put us onto the first slide then? I'm afraid that you're going to have to put up with this until it goes on to Marc. I'm going to have to ask Marc for each slide. So the first thing I wanted to say, after seeing how international we are, and it's very apt actually, is that it often gets forgotten because Shetland tends to be seen as quite a remote location now. That when you turn it on its head and realise that if you're in a boat, Shetland is suddenly quite central. And this will come up a lot more in Marc's section afterwards, but I just wanted to highlight the fact that remote can also be central, because you can be in the middle of nowhere and simultaneously the middle of everywhere. And that's very much been typical of Shetland's history and archaeology. Can I have the next slide, please, Marc? Everywhere, pretty much in the world, to be honest, before roads became a common method of transport, the boat was your key way of getting around. Up in the Isles, obviously, this has persisted longer than it did elsewhere. And still today, the main method of inter-island transport is still roll-on, roll-off ferries. So the boat is still perhaps a more key method of transport than it might be elsewhere. And of course, fishing is still one of Shetland's major industries. I would say, though, that this was very much the case everywhere. And I think we forget very, very easily how vital and central boats were to life in the past, wherever you live. This isn't just an archipelago thing. This is everywhere up until very, very recently. It's just Shetland goes up until the 1970s before some of the bridges went in and small boats stopped being a key way of getting between some of the isles. I'm going to roll you back now a few thousand years, and we're going to start from the first settlers. So the earliest known site on Shetland is a shell midden at West Fow in Sombra, which is on the absolute southern tip of Shetland. So it's the nearest to Fair Isle and Orkney. That was excavated in about 2009, I think. And it was radiocarbon dated to between 4000 and 3000 BC. So it lies on what in Scotland anyway is the Mesolithic Neolithic transition. So that's the transition between hunter-gathering and farming. This we think lies in the early Neolithic. However, it's very hard to tell whether the people inhabiting this particular site were farmers or hunter-gatherers, because it is a midden, so it's where the rubbish was disposed of from what they've been eating. It's a massive midden with deposits of shellfish, seal bone, seabirds, and cetaceans, so whales and dolphins. These have been built up in what look like seasonal layers. This could be seasonal use. It could point to people coming to Shetland first seasonally and then going back to wherever they were, or it could point to people living elsewhere within mainland Shetland and coming to the coast seasonally. But the people that lived here were living off the sea. They would have been a low population at this time, very, very low, probably. They seem to be the first people that we've got evidence of. And so marine life would have been, and coastal life would have been prolific. It would have been very easy to get food from the sea. I would say that this may not be Shetland's absolute first settlers, because because of coastal erosion, we may well have, and sea level rise, we may well have lost some of the coastal areas that show with the earliest habitation. Sorry, I've just realised I'm not getting a little record message. Is it recording?
You're being recorded.
Excellent, thank you. I'm just a little bit paranoid after I have to say failed to record the last one, but that's cool. Thank you. Sorry about that, everybody. So the first site at Westfoe was on that transition between hunter-gatherers and farmers, and they must have reached Shetland, obviously, by boat. In this time period, we have no idea what boat we're looking at. It was something that adequately transported them up from, presumably, up from Orkney via Fairarm. Could I have the next slide, please, Mark? However, after this early evidence of resorting to the sea and using the sort of bounty of the ocean, they then very rapidly seem to have come in line with the early Neolithic everywhere else in the UK. And this was very unexpected, to be honest. When they started doing stable isotope analysis, evidence suddenly came up that when people started farming, they turned away from the sea. They presumably still traveled by sea, but they weren't eating. They were eating very little marine-based, very limited marine-based material in their diet. The evidence, obviously, this is early days. This is work that was done on the Sombra graves, which, if those of you who know Shetland Museum, there's a reconstruction of one of those sets of human remains in the lady's head that's in one of the early cases there, and that she was buried at Sombra with 18 other people. So MNI in my slide means minimum number of individuals. So at least 18 people with grave goods were buried together. The children seem to have gone through quite a pronounced, well, all of them had gone through pronounced periods of difficulty, periods of starvation and potentially ill health, which isn't particularly unusual in that time period. It was a difficult time, no hospitals, no antibiotics. It was very easy for, no vaccinations, very easy for a simple illness to become life-threatening. But what the evidence seems to be coming from Sombra is that they still were relying, despite struggling, they were still relying on farming and only turning to the sea when they were in really difficult times. And the children, before they died, were suddenly getting a marine-based diet, which has been interpreted to suggest that they were desperate and they were feeding the children anything they could get hold of to make sure they were okay. And unfortunately, we don't know the cause of death, but for whatever reason it didn't work, whether it was illness or malnutrition that killed them. So there's a really interesting challenge early on where you would expect that they would be very reliant on the sea, just like Shetlanders have been ever since. But the evidence seems to be suggesting that they were very keen to make a go of farming, and for whatever reason were kind of avoiding marine resources until they had to deal with it. And on this slide at the bottom, there's actually this is a paper, if anyone's interested. This is a paper that's available online, and we can send anybody the link to it if anybody's interested afterwards to have a look at it. So as we go forward, obviously we're going through quite quickly today, so I'm going to fast forward, and if we can have the next slide, please. And I will say, from a sea-facing point of view, Shetland carries on right through much of the rest of prehistory, behaving in a similar way when it comes to connectivity in the sea. They are definitely keeping up with the neighbours. The fashions and architecture and material culture are changing at perhaps a slightly slower rate than the mainland or Orkney, but not substantially. The site we've got at the top is Stanidale Temple, in inverted commas, because we don't think it's a temple anymore. That was a name it was given when it was excavated in the 40s and 50s. It's a big Neolithic Bronze Age hall of some kind. Again, not dissimilar to the kind of thing you're seeing at Nessa Brodgar in Orkney, and in Timber in Aberdeenshire. The Brocks are spreading all over mainland Scotland and the Isles. Technology is spreading. These people, and I'm going to keep reiterating it, but these people aren't cut off. These are people who know what's happening on the mainland. They know what's happening on Orkney, and they're keeping up with it. And if anything, the archaeology tells us up here is that this isn't an isolated set of islands. These guys are obviously competent seafarers who are going backwards and forwards. And I think you often don't see the boats at this period because obviously we have no material evidence. We still don't know what they look like. We still don't know what their capacity was and what they were used for. We do know that they were consuming marine resources again by this time. They were fishing to a certain degree. They were using other coastal resources. We also know that they were transporting animals up and down. They were transporting grain. They were importing. They were exporting. So there was a lot going on right through this period, even though we don't actually see evidence of the ships. And could I have the next slide, please, Marc? Thank you. We first start to see it with the Pictish and early Norse period. We suddenly start to see evidence of boats. Among one of my favorites is this graffiti from Jarlshof, which is interpreted as a seagoing Scandinavian vessel in the NMS label. It presumably is an early Norse or Viking ship. There's also actually no reason why this couldn't be depicting the Pictish vessel as well. We actually have no evidence one way or another. This could be Pictish, it could be Viking. This has got quite a wide, some of the dating at Jarlshof, with it being an early excavation, is quite wide. And so this is on the cusp, potentially, of Viking versus Picts. The papal stone at the top appears to be representing the monks coming over the sea. And certainly with the Picts, Christianity came to Shetland. And we know that missionaries were traveling across the sea. And there's even a little bit of marble up here that's come from Rome, which was brought up presumably as a relic by one of these early missionaries. So again, really, really not cut off at people up here. And they were, while people had been coming in and out over hundreds and hundreds, well, by this time, thousands of years to and from Shetland, and before our first perception of boats becoming significant with the Vikings. And if I can have my next slide, please, Marc. And with the Vikings or the early Norse, we're tending to move more towards calling them early Norse now, because Viking was more a job description than a people. So Viking was something you did, not who you were. And very much as we're working more with isotopic analysis and what have you, we're more and more of the Vikings we're realizing aren't necessarily Scandinavian. They're not all Scandinavians. These are people who are taking on Viking as a cultural identity rather than necessarily something they have in their DNA. So suddenly Shetland, for the first time, it appears, looks west. Before that, all the contact appears to be from mainland Scotland and Orkney. There's no evidence of the archaeology being anything like what's found in Scandinavia, despite the fact that we're only a day's sail from Norway, which is much the same as we are from mainland UK. They just don't seem to have looked west, and the Norwegians don't seem to have looked east until they start what they call the migration period. We would call the Viking or early Norse period. Suddenly, as they start to arrive on Shetland, and we don't have very early evidence of them, the Viking Hunts project in the early 2000s was looking for sort of first settlement sites, but never found any. Most of the evidence we've got in the North Isles is sort of 9th and definitely 10th century and onwards, rather than the really early stuff. But that's probably because if you were just looking for a staging point, if you were a Viking, you would just stop off briefly in Shetland, probably take on water, take on food, stop overnight potentially. They were all quite self-sufficient. You wouldn't necessarily leave any archaeological remains behind you. So it's not really surprising that we're not finding those early sites. But very quickly, they began to settle. And we have the greatest intensity of rural longhouses anywhere outside of Sweden in terms of in our archaeology. And we started off, you start to see the material culture coming in. We started off importing steatite bake plates from Norway, but by 950, which is really pretty early, we're exporting them because they're taking advantage of the steatite, the soapstone that's naturally occurring on Shetland. And at Catpund, you can still see the scars on the quarry where they were carving out these bowls and plates and lamps and things. And they've taken advantage of these, turned it around, and we're actually exporting to Orkney, then to Faroe and the West Isles, and eventually to Sweden. We're exporting bake plates, which are made out of steatite, which are a bit like a flat sort of griddle type of idea to make bannocks on, if you were, or that sort of thing, back out to the Scandinavians. So it's a bit of, I apologize for people abroad who don't understand this expression, but it's a bit like coals to Newcastle, the idea of exporting something back that they originally imported to you. And this sees the beginning of Shetland's relationship with fishing in a serious way, rather than just a subsistence fishing. We see evidence of intensive deep water fishing because they've got the technology to do it. The boats they've got by this point are capable of dealing with the deep water, the strong currents. We've got fishing weights from this period, again, often made out of steatite. We've got a lot of evidence of this, and it's very likely the quantity that's coming out of evidence that's coming out of Orkney and Shetland is likely that they're exporting to the Viking towns of the UK and possibly Scandinavia, because suddenly places like York or Dublin are demanding dried fish in huge, unprecedented quantities, because you're almost supporting what are effectively small cities in these terms. And so import and export becomes vital. And Shetland, rather again than being remote, Shetland is just a cog in that wheel, that they are exporting dried fish and soapstone. So I'm going to hand over now to Marc, who's going to take you into a little bit more detail about their boats and how it then developed on from there.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Esther. Yeah, well, this leads on quite nicely, actually, from what Esther was talking about from the Norse beginning commercial fishing, probably around about the 12th century, I think. We could look at some of their boats. I mean, the boat in the photograph here is a 4-oared boat, known as a faring in Norwegian. This boat dates from around about 850 CE and was part of the funeral furniture of the Gokstad ship, which was found in Western Norway around about 1880. It was a large ship. It was a sort of multi-purpose ship, really. It was suitable for transporting cargo and could have also been used as a raiding ship as well. Within the funeral furniture of that vessel were 3 boats. This 4-oared boat, which is can be seen on display in the Maritime Museum in Oslo, in the Viking Ship Museum, sorry, which is part of the Maritime Museum in Oslo. There's also a 6-oared boat, which is in West Norwegian called a seksering, and in Shetland, a 6-oared boat is called a sixerine or a sixen, and the 4-oared boat in Shetland is called a foreen or foren. And there's also a larger boat, which is probably an 8-oared boat, but that was completely destroyed. So the 4-oared boat and the 6-oared boat were restored and are now on display. So the thing with Shetland is there's not a lot of timber. So there's not much in the way of wood to build boats or to build houses or to build pretty much anything really. So from around about 850, when the Norse first arrived, a timber trade began. And as Esther was saying, you know, trading relations with Norway were key really, both back and forth. So as Esther was saying, Shetland had fish to export, and in return it would want to import timber and also some grain as well. Shetland, that you know, has always been not self-sufficient in producing grain, so that was one of the things that people would trade in. The trading relationship with Norway continued until Shetland moved away in 1469 from Norway. And the reason for that was that Orkney and Shetland were basically pawned. The proper name for that is impignorated. Basically, King Christian of Denmark, King Christian I of Denmark, had a daughter, Margaret, and she was betrothed to King James III of Scotland. And as part of the dowry settlement, King Christian I had to raise some cash. So he pawned, first of all, Orkney, then he pawned Shetland. And that's when Orkney and Shetland moved across to Scotland. And we've been part of Scotland ever since. So you might wonder why King Christian I would want to raise money by pawning Shetland and Orkney. Really, he probably didn't really want to do that. The problem was that there wasn't much money at that time. King Christian had spent quite a lot of money on wars between the Hanseatic League. So he had to raise money quite quickly. So that's the way he did it. Although Shetland became part of Scotland in 1469, trading relations still continued with Norway pretty much uninterrupted. And that trade with Norway, particularly for timber and for boats, continued until the mid-19th century. The first documented evidence for the boat trade is found in documents in the 15th century. And interestingly, there wasn't much evidence for trade with Shetland, but there was more evidence of trade with Orkney. But the trade did exist. With wooden boats, you need to repair them and you need to build them. And you need timber to do that. So moving to the next slide, if you look at where Shetland is, you can see it's not very far to travel east to Bergen. And it was that part of Norway, Western Norway, where the timber trade was based. I've also highlighted on here Hamburg and Bremen, because during this period in the 15th century, there were German merchants coming to Shetland each summer. There's documented evidence for around about 10 ships coming from Hamburg and Bremen to various parts of Shetland. And the German merchants came really to trade in fish. So the Shetlanders would catch the fish. the landowners would rent beaches and booths to the German merchants, and the German merchants would bring with them necessaries for Shetland. They'd bring things like fishing lines, hooks, but they'd bring wine, grain. There's evidence of them bringing soap, shoes, all kinds of goods, which they would trade with Shetlanders for fish. The fish by this period were being caught using a long line system. The long lines were several miles long, with hooks roughly about 3 meters apart. And the hooks were baited with haddock quite often. And the fish they were fishing for were cod and tusk. Once the fish were caught, they were landed at fishing stations that were dotted around Shetland, and the fish were dried on stone beaches, or airs as they're called in Shetland. And the fish were first washed in salt water and then salted and then dried on the beaches. As Esther was saying, Shetland is not remote at all. It was a hub of trade. And it wasn't just the Germans that were coming to Shetland during this period. The Dutch were also coming to fish for herring in the summer. So there'd be a fleet of Dutch herring buses which would come to Shetland. There would moor in Lerwick, just off Lerwick in Bressa Sound. And then round about June, they would go off to catch herring. So as I was saying, timber and boats came from Western Norway. And the main area where these boats and the timber came from was Bjørnafjorden, which is just south of Bergen. And the main areas were Tysnes, Strandvik, Fusa, and Us. And so in the spring, merchants would go from Shetland. It was a small trade, so it wasn't the Norwegians bringing boats to Shetland. It was the Shetlanders actually going in ships to Norway and then coming back with timber and boats. We know certainly by the 17th century that it was a triangular trade. So going back to my previous slide, so ships would first sail with cargoes of dried fish, and they would sail to Hamburg. And then they would then travel to Bergen. So they'd sell their fish in Hamburg. Quite often they would take salt as ballast, go to Bergen, and then they would load timber and boats and then go back to Shetland. Boats were exported to Shetland in one of two ways. They were either unset up, i.e. in boards, and there's been a notion that these were kits. The actual evidence points to more of being timber that was rough cut to shape. So they weren't really kits. They were pre-cut units ready to be assembled, but to assemble them required an awful lot of work. There's documented evidence to suggest that it took 2 weeks to build a boat from boards. And then boats were also imported ready built, i.e. set up. The small boats had their frames taken out, and the boats would be stacked one within the other upon the deck of the importing ship. Because wooden boats are hand built, no two boats were exactly the same. And so it was important that the frames, before they were taken out, were marked with the boat, so you knew exactly which frame belonged to which boat and whereabouts within the boat the frame was set. The frames were actually inserted into the boats using trunnels or tree nails. So it was quite easy for the frames to be removed. You just wouldn't have to put the wedge into the tree nail. before fastening the frame, and that way you could just lift them out basically. The boats being imported to Shetland at this time were the West Norwegian type, so they were the fairing and the sexering. There's also limited evidence for 8-oared boats being used in Shetland during this period. Here we have an Ussava boat. This is from the late 19th century. You can see that the boat is rigged with a sprit sail, and the small triangular sail at the front is called the jib. Originally, these boats were square-sailed rigged, so the mast would be more in the middle of the boat with one sail. But these would have been the boats that would have come to Shetland right from the Norse period all the way through to the 19th century. Obviously, they changed slightly during the decades and the centuries, and certainly we know by the late 18th century that Shetlanders were beginning to develop their own types of boats. By the late 18th century, by about 1780, deep seawater fishing was moving further offshore. By this time, boats would be traveling no more than 20 to 30 miles. 30 miles would be the absolute limit, and that remained true all the way through the 19th century. There's a bit of a myth that Shetland sixerenes were sailing off to the far half, which is an Old Norse derived word meaning deep water fishing, and that they were traveling sort of 50, 60 miles offshore. That's absolute nonsense. There's absolutely no documented evidence for that whatsoever. There is documented evidence for them traveling up to a maximum of 30 nautical miles offshore, but the weather had to be exceptionally settled and calm. As you can see, these boats are not particularly large. This is a 4-oared boat. So a 6-oared boat of the early 19th century would be probably double the size of this faring. An interesting aside in this boat, I don't know if you can see, I don't know if the cursor can go over it, but there's this box in the back of the boat. This box is basically, they call it a fish coffin. And when you caught your fish in Western Norway, you didn't kill them. You kept them live by putting them into this box, which was towed behind the boat. And you can see these holes which allow water in. And the box floated just below the surface of the water. And that kept the fish live till you got to market. And you sold your fish live, which is quite different to how things operated in Shetland. I'd also like to point out the rudder assembly and the tiller, which there's no evidence for this use in Shetland. The Shetland helm, as it's called, or tiller, is quite different. It actually slots over the top of the rudder stock. It doesn't have this side piece on it. So as Esther was saying earlier on, you know, to get around Shetland, a boat was needed. In fact, people had boats as we have cars today. So pretty much every family that lived along the coast of Shetland, which is the majority of people, would have had a boat, would have had a 4-oared boat, similar to the one in the photograph here. This photograph here was taken locally. I live in on an island called Burra. Wester Corf is on the east side. It's on the mainland, so it's not far from where I live. And boats typically went back and forth, taking people and goods all the time. In fact, the minister travelled from an island just off Lerwick called Bressa, and he came to his parish in Corf, and then he travelled from Corf to Burra, of course, by boat. You know, everybody went by boat. There's documented evidence of young children using boats. Women using boats was common practice, and in fact, during the 19th century, in the first fishing boat register in 1869, there are 3 women recorded as being boat owners, which is quite unusual for that period. So boats were used for, as in this photograph here, as taxis, but they were also used for transporting shingle, for transporting livestock, and for transporting fish, and also for fishing and peats. So they're used for pretty much everything. Here's a photograph of a typical 19th century sixareen. The sixareen is called Industry, and it's photographed here sailing at a regatta in Wales in around about 1880, 1882, something like that. You can see the skipper here is hunkered down in the back of the boat, and you can see the difference between the Norwegian helm and the helm on a Shetland boat, which slots over the top of the rudder stock there. The sail is an asymmetric square sail, and it's a dipping square sail, of course. So every time you wanted to change your direction, you would have to drop the sail and then undo the sheet at the back here, undo the tack, and the yard would be passed around the front of the mast and then hoisted on the new tack. Today, there's very little in terms of wooden boats in Shetland, but there's quite a lot of archaeology. And this really is the last remnants of a culture which was very dependent upon small open boat use. In the top left-hand picture, you can see what a structure, a boat shelter, which in Shetland we call a noost, and in Norway is called a naust. In parts of Shetland, the Norwegian word naust is used, particularly on the east coast island of Wåsa. This noost here is part of this fishing station on the right-hand side, which is Featherland, which was the largest whitefish fishing station in Shetland. It's not particularly big, which is quite surprising considering how busy it was. And there's documented evidence from the 18th century and early 19th century that the stations were so busy and there were so many men there and boys that the fish was being spoiled because people were having to walk across the fish to get to where they had to go. And as well as that, you can see these buildings here, they're called booths. And this is where the fishermen during the week in the summer would live. So each booth would house a boat's crew of 6 people, and they would be burning peat. So they'd have peat fires to cook and to keep warm. And there's also accounts of ashes being spilt on the fish and spoiling the fish. And this was a major problem. Okay, so that's kind of it really. Have you got anything you'd like to add, Esther?
No, I don't think so. Just to say, as on the slide there, thank you very much. And if you want to find out more, feel free to have a look at our website, because there's loads of blog posts that you can kind of dig into and find out about all kinds of random things, to be honest. Blogs by ourselves or guest blogs as well. So yeah, just open up the floor now, I think, if anybody's got any questions. Or if you want to put questions in the chat, we can do it that way as well.
Can I come in?
Yeah, of course.
Yep, okay. I've known Steve for a number of years. We lost touch a little bit. And I would love so much to come up to Shetland sometime and visit him. We'll do it in the next year, Steve, once COVID restrictions are lifted. And this has been an absolutely fascinating insight into your history on your islands. I found it so interesting. It really has. It's been absolutely fantastic, and I have to thank you for what you've done tonight and how you've put it together. That's my input. Thank you.
It's very kind. Thank you, Jim.
Oh, we're getting lots of questions in the comments. Hang on. I will read them out and then we'll see who gets to answer them, depending what they relate to. Oh, Caroline says, are nooses as old as boats, or were they tethered in a different manner originally? I think the answer to that is we don't really know, to be honest. Marc, you'd probably want to elaborate on that one.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Esther. And it's a great question, Caroline. We really don't know. As Esther was saying earlier on, the first settlers that came to Shetland, we have no idea what their boats were like. There's just no archaeological record of them. They were coming from mainland Scotland, presumably. And so there's been lots of hypotheses about whether they were hide boats or whether they were expanded log boats, dugouts, but we have no idea whatsoever. And boats would have had to been stored. As we all know, Shetland is pretty windy. There's lots of sheltered voes. So a voe in Shetland is an inlet, basically. Mini fields, I suppose you could think of them, which are more sheltered than the coastal areas. And that's where you find most of the boat shelters, to be honest, are in sheltered areas. The one in the photograph here, we've got two different types of boat shelter. The one on the left with me standing in is a stone-built structure. And the one that Esther's standing in is a scooped out shelter. They're the main two types, really. And we don't really know some of the noose have been documented to the medieval period, to the late Norse period. So that's sort of 13th century. There's a couple of noose on Unts that have been dated to that period using optical stimulating luminescence. Esther will be able to talk much more about that than I can. So it's a bit of a mystery, really. The interesting point here in terms of a cultural boat shelter is that these boat nooses are quite different to those noosts or nousts that are found in Western Norway. A noust in Western Norway is basically a boat house with a slipway running from it. So they're proper structures, and quite often, so they're wooden structures, wooden sheds basically on water or near water with a slipway made of timber, quite often with either timber shingles on the roof, or I've seen some of them have stone like slate. It's not slate, but it's stone tiles. Have you got anything you'd like to add to that, Esther?
I'm being slightly distracted because someone in the comments had asked for the link for the paper that I posted. I'm on like multiple devices, so I'm gonna Facebook it to you, Marc, and see if you can put it into the chat, because I'm on an iPad, so I can't have multiple windows open.
Oh, right, okay.
So I'm just gonna Facebook you the link and see if you can put it in the chat. Early noosts. I think I probably can't add much to that, to be honest. And there's a few more connected questions in the chat to do with that. Let me just find them. I noticed a few there. Where is it? Oh, yes. Where you get the major living centres like brocks and wheelhouses, do you get associated boat noosts? I would love to be able to say yes, but we don't actually have. Very few of our noosts have any kind of date attached to them. The earliest dated noost in Shetland is potentially Norse, potentially as early as the 13th century, but that's the earliest one we've actually got any dating evidence for, and that was found and dated because it was beside an excavated Norse site at Underhool. I suspect, given the way that was filled, backfilled with soil and debris and what have you, and had to be excavated, I think there's a good chance if there are earlier ones, they've probably long gone either through erosion or through just purely being buried, as archaeology does, disappear through the years. So at the moment, we've got absolutely no evidence of pre-Norse noosts. I suspect there are more early noosts. The Underhool ones, you wouldn't be able to tell by looking at them. They look exactly the same as later noosts. So it's one of the fascinating and frustrating thing about noosts is distinguishing the early ones. I'm sure there are at least plenty more Norse ones about, but trying to identify them without excavating them all, and even then there'll be very, very limited dating evidence available within it. So again, someone has asked about the distribution of early Norse noosts. We don't actually have any early Norse noosts identified, unfortunately. I'm sure they were there, but we haven't identified them. One of the things Mark and I have been doing is recording new sites around Shetland, gathering data from the community. During lockdown, we've recorded over 100 noose with photographs and stories and things attached to them. So we are trying to gather data about noose, but it's something that's relatively unknown, to be honest, at the moment. I'm trying to see if there's any. What I don't think there's any more noosed ones right now. Mark is looking after the web link, I think.
I'm trying to.
While you're doing that, I'll see if there's any more archaeology ones. Hang on.
Okay.
That I can answer. Are nooses found on the Scottish mainland? I can answer that they are. Yes. Mark might elaborate more, but they are found elsewhere. Yes.
Yeah, they're found in Orkney as well, aren't they, Esther?
Thank you. Thank you, Val Turner, who's our regional archaeologist, has just updated on some new dating from the Underhool Longhouse. So there's a possibility we can actually claim a Viking date for that site, which would be amazing if that was the case. That could end up being earlier. Cool, thanks, Val. So is that I'm going to ask Val this now, which is weird through the chat, unless Val wants to unmute herself and say the answer. Has the actual noose been redated, or just the is it the dates that have been run again on the noose? That would be brilliant.
No, sorry, Esther, it's not the noose that we've redated, it's the Longhouse.
That's what I thought you must mean, and then I suddenly thought, oh, that would be very exciting. No, that's really interesting though, because if the Longhouse has gone earlier, then there's a lot more chance for earlier noose. That's cool.
Yeah, especially as that's the upper one, and you'd kind of expect the lower one to be potentially earlier.
Yeah, that's really exciting. We might actually get into Viking territory with this then.
Absolutely, it is a bit of a game changer. But anyway, if Steve wanted me to talk about why we don't find early Viking longhouses, then there you go. That's an offer, Steve, if you want it.
I would love you to come and talk about that. I'm sure.
Yes,
I'm sure Steve will too.
We're going to need to.
I'd love them to continue tonight as well.
Yeah, we're going to need to schedule that one, Val.
Yeah, that's the next one. That's now a commitment. No, that would be brilliant.
Hold on, Esther. While I'm unmuted, if Mark would share the PowerPoint again, we could probably go back to the slide that had your link on it, and people could just write it down.
Yeah, it's a good idea, because I can't.
Are you struggling to? Yeah, I was struggling to get it in because I've got a PC without my Zoom's on an iPad. And I've got the link on a PC, and I'm like, there's too many different directions to go.
It's that one there, isn't it, Esther? Is there a link there? Yeah, at the bottom here, look.
You're still sharing Facebook at the second.
Am I?
Oh, yes.
It's all
right. It's just the Moder Dy page. It's nothing.
Yeah, but I actually haven't got that on my screen.
Has it frozen? I wonder. That's all.
I don't know. It's not actually on my screen. I've got the presentation up.
Dave's found the link, although that's a mystery as to why you've still got the Moder Dy. Well, if anyone wants to know the Moder Dy Facebook page, it's now
It's
up on the
there.
screen.
But I can't. It's bizarre, isn't it?
Hang on a second. Whether we've got, I'll find you some more questions, Mark. I kind of filtered out. Oh, there's one more kind of Viking question, which Val may want to help in answering as well. But this says, was there any connection between Viking visitors to Shetland and Newfoundland? I would, as far as I'm aware, no, in terms of direct connection that we're aware of. But feel free to correct me, Val, if I'm.
No, I would go along with you. Although we kind of speculate that Shetland and Unst in particular could have been a jumping off point for exploration further north and west. Nevertheless, it's only speculation. Would be nice to prove, but no.
It would be great, wouldn't it? And we did the Vikings Uncovered programme a few years ago where they investigated both Newfoundland and Papua, but that doing the work with Sarah Parkak and satellite archaeology, but a sort of space archaeologist, so she gets tagged. But I don't think there's any. Yeah, there's no direct link, I'm afraid.
That question was from me because I work a lot on the coastline, both in Shetland and in Newfoundland and Labrador. And it looks so similar, those noosts, that I just wondered if there was some kind of connection, because archaeologically they look, obviously to an untrained eye, they look similar.
I suspect there is a connection in the sense of that this is the same culture that is travelling about and they will be taking the same ideas. But yeah, whether they've come through Shetland and taken this idea of an unroofed noost with them, or whether it's both jumped off from the sort of Norse naust and just kind of ended up with the same interpretation. I'm not sure, but I think it's certainly plausible that they came through Shetland.
I love the idea perhaps more than the reality.
The thing that is missing in Shetland, which I don't know, Val, if you've come across any, are large ship noosts, which there are in Norway. So, Norse period ships weren't huge by today's standards and generally were hauled ashore for safekeeping. And there's no evidence of large ship noose that I've come across in Shetland. I don't know if anybody else has come across those at all. It's something you would expect to see.
I bet it's because we're not recognising them, because noose, people know about noose because they go quite, they go up to quite recent times, whereas the bigger ones obviously don't. And I suspect it's more of a question that we're not seeing them because we've not got our right eyes in than that they don't exist.
Yeah, I've been looking on Google Maps recently, trying to see if I can identify any, but I've not come across any at the moment. It's just interesting, isn't it, that in the landscape they don't seem evident. I mean, they could have been destroyed, of course. They could have, but you'd expect there to be some remnants. Particularly at somewhere like Lund, Underhall, you'd expect there to be evidence of storing a decent sized vessel, sort of 50 foot or so, maybe a bit bigger, because this is what they were traveling in. But there isn't any that we've come across. It's just a quandary.
That'll keep us busy for a good new few years yet, Mark. Trying to,
it would do. Yeah, it will do.
Mission to try and. I think this is the thing with a lot of this, though, isn't it? It's kind of how much are we not seeing because we're not looking? How much has been lost? How much has been built over or reused? I mean, if you think of those noose we were looking at the Dale of Walls, where they even just within historic times they've been changed size and they've been adapted and they've shrunk them and you might be seeing reuse and adaptation that maybe you've over so many years, you've lost the size of the original noose if it's been shrunk
Yeah.
down to reuse as something else.
I mean, the one at Underhall is a good example of that as well, isn't it? The one that's been was turned into a saw pit. So yeah, I think you're right, Esther.
You may be losing some through reuse, and as Val says, maybe just not recognizing others because we're not setting out looking. No one's really set out looking for them with that question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's have a look what else we've got. There were definitely some Marc questions in here as well. There we go. Was there a local tradition of boat building in communities, or did the families purchase the boats already made?
That's a really good question, and it's a bit of both, actually. Certainly, there's documented evidence from the 18th century of merchants liaising with landowners on behalf of tenants for boats. And we always thought that the boats were actually rented to tenants. In some instances they were, but this seems to be to a lesser degree. And the boats that seem to have been rented were the larger six-oared boats, six-reens, which by the early 19th century were sort of a 10-meter size, sort of 30 feet over the stems. And the reason that those boats were rented was because they were actually only used for 3 or 4 months a year, and then they had no other function. You have to remember that people only wanted boats that they could actually maneuver and use easily. And you only use a big six-oared boat for either going to the deep sea fishing or for moving livestock and large items. So most people would obtain a boat, certainly up until the 1880s, from Western Norway via the landowner. And there's documents of orders of for boats. So by the late 18th century, people are specifying the size of keel that they wanted. And up until around about 1780, I keep mentioning 1780, it's a bit of a magic year really. Four-oared boats were more popular than six-oared boats. And then it all changes. There are also boat builders within the community. There's documented evidence of boat builders. These boat builders were, up until the late 18th century, were assembling West Norwegian boats and boards. And as I said previously, those boats would take roughly about 2 weeks to build. There's documented evidence from William Mowat, who kept meticulous records of boats being built to order. The boats and boards, as I said, were rough cut shaped boards, and building a wooden boat, which is a compound curve with overlapping strakes, which we call clinker in the UK, and in the States it's called lapstrake, requires an awful lot of skill. There were, certainly by the early 19th century, boat building was becoming extremely well established as a commercial enterprise. And that's when the West Norwegian boat building or import of West Norwegian boats began to decline. And that pretty much stopped by 1860. So yeah, so it's a long-winded way of answering your question, but yes, is the answer really. There were local boat builders who all had their own sort of boat builders. Each boat builder builds a boat in a slightly different way. Even if it's the same type of boat, everybody has their own kind of signature really and prefers doing things in one way. If you get a group of boat builders together, they'll always argue about which is the best way to do something. So yeah, they would have been quite distinct.
Marc,
We've got another one which is linked to this really, which is, are there any schemes to promote traditional boat building?
Yeah, there was. And certainly there's a few of us that try and keep traditional boat building skills alive, and there's still traditional wooden boat builders in Shetland. You know, there's one quite close to me, Tommy Icebester. He still builds boats and also makes fiddles as well. Yeah, the Community Trust a few years ago had some money to develop a boat building course, which I was partially involved in. Unfortunately, that really didn't get off the ground. There is a sixth serene called Vela May, which a group of us sail in the summer normally, before COVID came along. And we had 13 people that were regularly sailing that boat. So that was increasing in popularity, which meant that we were sailing that boat twice a week. So there is an interest there. It's just a matter of persevering, really. That's not really answered the question, I don't think, but.
Esther, Mark, I think Raju has their hand up to ask a question.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I've got the chat box open over the top of everybody. Ah, yes.
I think her arm's too tired to hit the unmute button.
Can I come back in again, guys? Mind?
Go for it, I think. If we,
Can
yeah.
can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
Yep. Okay. I've just, because I live in the River Clyde, I thought we must have traditional boat builders here. Yeah. And I've just Googled it, and there is Clydeside boat builders. And they are traditional boat builders, one of the few remaining yards in Scotland to create wooden boats in the time tradition fashion. So there you are. On the River Clyde, we are still building traditional wooden boats.
Yeah, well, Scotland's quite good, really, because there's also another group of boat builders based in Ullapool.
Oh, that's my favourite. That's my second favourite area of Scotland. Oh, I love Ullapool and the skiff competition every year. I just so love it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so there are the skiffs in Ullapool. I forgot to mention in Shetland we have yawl rowing competitions in the summer. So
Yeah.
there is yawl rowing.
Yeah. Well, this company, we've had a lot of controversy recently in our town, our Inverclyde area, because Inverclyde built the original, or Greenock, Port Glasgow built the original steamship called the Comet.
Mm-hmm.
And in Port Glasgow in Inverclyde, there was a replica of the Comet, the first original steamer, paddle steamer, and she has rotted away to an absolute wreck. And they're now having all sorts of fights as to whether they reproduce it in plastic to look like the original ship. And it's just become bizarre. It really has. So we might well end up with a plastic replica of the Comet, which was the first original world steamship, at Port Glasgow, which is only, what, 5 miles away from us, 6 miles away from us.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
replica's a bit disappointing, really.
We do have traditional boat builders still in the Clyde, which I'm quite surprised about. We have the Loch Seaforth down our way at the moment. She's broken down off Stornoway, and she came up the Clyde a couple of days ago, sorry, under tugs, and she can't fit in any dry dock at Greenock because there's none prepared to take her and none big enough, although we have one. And she may have to go to Belgium to get a new engine fitted.
Right, okay.
Yeah, you ask yourself, what are we doing? Anyway, I'm changing the subject from archaeology to modern mechanical engineering. I do apologise.
It's okay.
That's okay. Claire's got another question, Mark, which is about the noosts, different shapes of noosts. Because the noosts in your last image, which will be your Featherland image, were sort of square in shape, but others are pointed and bow shaped, like the ones in Fair Isle. is there any particular reason for the difference?
Actually, I think those ones in Featherland are boat shaped. Maybe, I'm not sure, Claire, are you confusing them with some of the booths?
Possibly it was the angle of the photo. Look,
Yeah, it
look
might
more
have been.
squared off,
Yeah, because those Featherland noose are
they're
definitely
quite
boat shaped.
they're not
They're
very pointy though, the Featherland
No,
ones.
they're not.
Quite,
they're curved.
they're quite kind
but-
of, they're quite
yeah.
a blunt end, the Featherland ones.
Yeah, they are.
So it's clear here. Can I just ask then, the building that we, or the, in the very last image, there was quite a square shape. What was the purpose of that?
Hang on, I'm just having a look at the last image. There's one, the image on the right hand side, which just has the, which is the noosed, that which is just that sort of horseshoe shape noosed, and there's the other image with all the buildings in.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, that is the noosed. I think it just looks square in that photo.
Okay.
But it does
Thank
actually
you.
have a rounded end. It's just quite a blunt end, maybe not as pointy as the ferrule.
Bluff. It's a bluff-ended noosed.
We do, I mean, there are regional variations and there are just family variations. We found certainly, haven't we, Mark, we've been looking at noosed. Like, I mean, quite a lot of the noosed we recorded on the west side at Brig of Wars or Bridge of Walls. I mean, that was built up, that was dry stone walled. It wasn't dug in at all. So, and apparently they're not uncommon on the west side, and so there are a bit of variations going on.
There are, and we talked about being unroofed, but there is some evidence of roof structures as well. Certainly at Coleswick, the noose at Coleswick were roofed. We don't know when they were roofed, and how many other nooses around Shetland were roofed. There's one at what's it called, Boroness on Yell. And that is allegedly the Laird's noosed, and that allegedly was a roofed noosed.
And that's really interesting because that brings it back closer to these Norwegian noosed.
It does. Yeah. And I suppose if you had a boat, you'd want, if you could, you'd want to have it sheltered with a roof.
I wonder if it would have been for working purposes. They wouldn't have. I just wondered if they had a cover on them, would they then have been almost boat houses for working on boats or repairing, or was it protection?
Yeah, a lot of people in Shetland built boats outside. In fact, that was common practice to build boats outside, which is different to Norway. In Norway practice, they built them indoors. Shetland's more like Faroe, really, because in Faroe they built their boats outside. I can't imagine building a boat outside. I struggle enough in a shed working on a boat, let alone working on a boat outside with just hand tools. Very difficult. I mean, locally there was a well-known boat builder in Shetland called Walter Duncan, and he was apprenticed through Hay and Company to Malcolm Lawrenson and his brother Adam Lawrenson, who are extremely well-known boat builders in Shetland. And they operated out of Blacksness in Scalawa. And certainly when he finished his apprenticeship, he went to Hamnavoe, and there was a herring fishing station in Hamnavoe, and he was actually building boats at the herring fishing station, and he was outside. He then managed to acquire, I think it was a hut used to make barrels, and he acquired a hut which he disassembled and took it across from where the herring station was into the village of Hamnavoe. He then had to try and find a piece of land, which he eventually found, which is on a slope. So he had to level the land, which is moving several tons of earth to level the ground. And then he rebuilt the shed, and he had a shed to build boats in. And that shed's still standing, although it's in a bit of disrepair. I've been in it a few years ago, and it's a lovely shed. In my opinion, it should be listed, but that's a whole can of worms, really. But it's quite a unique structure in Shetland. yeah, most people built boats outside. There were two boat builders, the old builders down in Dunrossness. One built outside and the other built indoors. And the person that built boats indoors built twice as many boats as the person that built boats outside.
And on that
Thank you.
topic, Dave has also pointed out that as scarce as lumber is in Shetland, a roof would probably be quite a luxury.
Yeah, it would
To
be a
have on your-
luxury.
Yeah,
It would be a luxury. It would cost quite a lot of money. You know, I mean, we haven't mentioned wooden buildings at all tonight, but there were Stockstover houses in Shetland, which were imported from Western Norway. So it's not impossible. However, in Shetland, the roofing system would have been different to that in Norway, because it would have been a tekkit roof, wouldn't it? It would have been like traditional Shetland houses with their thatched roofs. The roofs probably of the boathouses would have been thatched. So you wouldn't require as much timber to do that. And to make the laths for the tekkit roof to lie upon, quite often bits of old boat were used to do that. So strakes from old boat. In fact, there's a picture in the archive. You can find it online. I had a look at it today. I can't remember what it's called, but it's the remains of an old roof, just the trusses with the laths going across, and part of the roof there's an old yole rudder that's been repurposed to form part of the support structure for a tekkit roof. So, and the roofed noose at Coleswick, I think there's a photo in the archive as well of that, which is available online. Those noose were thatched, roofed.
and they were quite, if I remember rightly, I haven't seen the photograph for a while, so correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, but they were quite low, those roofs as well. You wouldn't have necessarily be able to get in and work on your boat very well. It was just to protect your boat, basically.
Just to protect your boat, yeah. And it'd been incredibly dark, which of course, out of interest, the noose in Norway, the naus in Norway were windowless. So, you know, you had to have the front of the noose or the naus open, so you got some daylight. But they're very dark structures, yeah. And
linking into that, from now that we're back to Norway again, Valerie's asking, when they brought the planks from Bergen, did they also bring the sails, and what were they made of?
Oh, that's a really good question. The answer is no. As far as we know, there's evidence of sail material being purchased from Germany, from Hamburg. So requests by lairds for sail making material, which probably would have been flax originally. And it's an interesting thing about Shetland sails is they were never really barked. You know, they weren't the traditional red sail that you see elsewhere in the UK. They were white. And Carol Christensen from the museum said that's because they were made from flax, and flax, when it's exposed to sunlight, bleaches. So all the documented evidence from the 19th century is of white sails in Shetland. The sail pattern in Shetland is quite different to that in Western Norway, and it's also different to that in Faroe. Faroe, the sail was it was a square sail until quite late, and it was only in the 19th century when the Danish administrator Ployen came to Shetland that he really studied the Shetland asymmetric dipping lug sail and took that back to Faroe. So the Shetland sail is quite unique. The 19th century version is quite unique to Shetland.
I think that's us almost out of question at the second, although Dave's saying in Newfoundland they scavenged a lot of wreck lumber and whalebone for some structures, which is
exactly
happened over here as well.
Exactly, yeah. And timber washed up on beaches is a valuable resource, and was certainly sawn up and used for boat building and house building and everything else, really. And there's still quite a few beaches. There's one on Unst called Trewick. There's various beaches around Shetland called Trewick or similar names. way.
My mother, although obviously as you can tell from my accent, I'm English. Well, Mark and I are both English, but originally, but my connection with Shetland went back to my grandfather, and my mother she used to come up on holidays in the 50s when she was a little child. She was sort of when she was 5 onwards, and she can still remember the beaches in Shetland being absolutely, well, she can remember the flip boats, and she came up in the Earl of Zetland, but she can remember the beaches being piled with wood and seeing people down there, you know, with the going through the wood that had been washed up and salvaging and sewing things up. Yeah, and she's in her 70s now, so it's, you know, it's quite recent that wood became and I was beginning to think during lockdown we might end up resorting to that at this rate, when wood became difficult to come by.
Yeah, no, exactly. And actually I do look for crooks and things on beaches, you know, grown crooks, because you can make nice things. In fact, I made a shelf here, can't we see it, which is the brackets are made for grown crooks that I've sawn up to make brackets. Yeah, it is a valuable resource, and it's great. I love it because you're getting something for free, really. Yeah.
Well, if that's it, David could probably stop recording, and